There is such a movie with Nicolas Cage in the lead role, Lord of War. The main character of this movie, Yuri Orlov, is a cynical international arms dealer who is ready to supply his goods to anyone who is willing to pay. The creators of this movie stated that Orlov was almost a direct copy of a real person named Viktor Bout. Naturally, such a statement was immediately picked up by the media, whose efforts to date show that Orlov and Bout, for the mass public, have become a single person. Such a view, of course, is not objective, and today we will try to separate Viktor Bout from Yuri Orlov, telling different versions of the story. Meet the real Lord of War on the other side of the law. Our narrative today is built in a slightly non-typical way and includes 2 points of view on the biography of Viktor Bout. The first point of view, let's call it conventionally Western, is the well-known story that Bout was an international arms dealer. The second, let's call it the Russian one, says that Viktor was just a successful businessman who was made a scapegoat. The Western version is based on the book by Douglas Farrar, which collects the works of the main researchers in Bout's life within the Lord of War version. The Russian version is based on Alexander Gassiuk's book, which in turn represents conversations with Bout's close people and business partners and attempts to refute the Western version. Where the versions agree, we compiled facts and built a unified narrative from them. Where they do not, we gave both views in the format of opposition. We also tried to take only those facts which had evidence and proof at the level of investigations of law enforcement agencies of different countries, so that they are not our guesses but the results of the work of competent people. Viktor Anatolievich Bout was born in Dushanbe on January 13, 1967. His father was a driver and was engaged in repairing cars, and his mother was an accountant. Also in the family was Viktor's brother Sergei, who later became his business partner and is rumored to be engaged in independent commercial projects to this day. His family never belonged to the local nomenclature. It never had any influential connections. The brothers had to achieve everything exclusively by their own labor. Viktor graduated from high school with good grades, having already shown an interest in foreign languages. Thus, some of his classmates later recalled that already in high school, Bout spoke English quite well. Ability to learn languages predetermined the choice of university. It was MGIMO, Moscow State Institute of International Relations. However, the attempt to enter it ended in failure. Despite the fact that Viktor successfully passed all the exams, he was cut off the so-called Mandate Commission. The reason was trivial. In those years, in order to enter MGIMO, residents of the Soviet periphery were required to provide a recommendation from the local Republican Central Committee of the Communist Party. And despite the fact that Bout had excellent grades which allowed him to study in this educational institution, the party officials from Dushanbe did not give him such a recommendation. Bout's friends later attributed this to the desire of the local party apparatus to see their own national Tajik cadre in MGIMO. However, Viktor stoically endured this failure and went to serve in the army. After demobilization in 1987, Viktor decided to try his luck again with higher education, but this time he applied not to MGIMO, but to the Military Red Banner Institute of the Ministry of Defense of the USSR, better known as the Institute of Military Translators. His school successes in studying languages and conscientious service in the army were a great help. So this time, Viktor managed to get to the university bench. However, Bout does not have a diploma from this institution, and his name does not appear on the list of its graduates. Viktor only took a 10-month course in Portuguese, after which he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. Later, in the 2000s, Belgian journalist Dirk Drollens, who accompanied Bout on some business trips to Africa, claimed that he heard a story from him that he allegedly served in the military airborne forces and after completing his compulsory service was engaged in training the GRU Special Forces. However, Drollens himself has no solid evidence of this story. But there is a lot of evidence that after receiving the rank of lieutenant, Viktor Bout was sent to Belarus to the 339th Vitebsk Regiment of Military Transport Aviation, where he served as an interpreter and radio operator. This regiment performed various flying missions in Angola, Mozambique, and other African countries. Some journalists claim that Viktor Bout was a KGB resident in Rome between 1985 and 1989, but this version does not stand up to criticism. It is difficult to even imagine for what merits an 18-year-old boy could get a place in the residency, which worked in the capitalist country. Only the son of a high-ranking official could expect such a sweet position, but certainly not a provincial from Dushanbe, who was cut off when entering MGIMO because of the lack of one certificate. And these journalists also forgot, or rather ignored, the fact that in 1985, Viktor Bout was still doing his military service in Transcarpathia. In 1989 to 1990, Viktor worked as an interpreter at the Soviet military mission in Mozambique. This mission, as well as many others stationed in those countries that had friendly relations with the USSR, was engaged in combat training of local personnel, teaching them to work with Soviet weapons and military equipment. There, in Mozambique, in the Soviet embassy, Viktor met a woman, Alla, who later became his wife, and 3 years after marriage gave birth to his daughter. There is a version that Bout owes his career to his wife. She was allegedly the daughter of a high-ranking state security official, but this version is nothing more than a fiction of the yellow press. Alla Bout's parents were the most ordinary Soviet servants. In 1991, Viktor Bout decided to quit the army. His thoughts were not yet associated with the organization of a huge transport company, and he, to begin with, engaged in a simpler business. According to the memories of Bout's wife, Alla, the first big money was earned by Viktor on consumer goods, which he brought with friends from Europe. The budding businessman went through the sale of canned beer in stalls and through the sale of cheap things brought by shuttles. Quite quickly, it became clear that really big money on such trade is not to earn. That's when Bout thought about becoming an airline broker, especially since all the previously acquired knowledge and acquaintances were very much in favor of it. Bout later dryly explained the path that led him into the business. After leaving the army in 1991, I worked in the Union of United Cooperatives of the USSR, which at that time was headed by academician Tikhonov. In this organization, there was a center for organizing air travel, and I was able to study this business more deeply. Then I acted for a long time as a broker for the organization of chartered transportation, and only then we started buying airplanes and creating our own airline. At first, Viktor Bout was going to bring Soviet aircrafts to the Latin American market of air transportation as an air broker. He was interested in the possibility of opening a business in Brazil, where he even visited in the summer of 1991. But this plan was not destined to come true, and instead, Bout began to organize business in Angola. From the times of military translation work in Mozambique, Bout had numerous acquaintances who worked in various UN programs related to the supply of food and other humanitarian aid, which helped him to establish business with Angola, where the civil war had just ended and this country needed humanitarian aid and building materials, with which Bout started. The problem was that it was extremely difficult to get all of his cargo. The few airfields that were in the country had been destroyed in the civil conflict. Bout solved this problem by installing the cargoes on board the airplane in special pallets and then dropping them by parachute to the desired location. These cargoes were to be delivered by IL-76 airplanes, formerly part of the 339th Military Transport Aviation Regiment, which was based in Vitebsk. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, these airplanes were transferred to the balance of the Belarusian company Transavia Export, and from there they were leased by the firm founders by Viktor Bout. That is, roughly speaking, Bout took the airplanes from Transavia and released them for transportation of humanitarian aid to the UN, taking the difference into his pocket. In addition to Bout's original idea of parachute cargo delivery, the UN appreciated these airplanes for the fact that a flight hour of the IL-76 was very cheap, about $500 to $600. For comparison, a similar flight hour of the American Hercules transport cost the UN $1.5 or even $2,000. Over time, Bout's company Vial did not have enough Transavia airplanes, and they began to rent them from other airlines created in a similar way as Transavia. Just so you understand how much this sublease was profitable for Bout was, he took airplanes in the former Soviet republics for an average of $300 for an hour of work and released them to the UN for $600 for the same hour. Bout was fortunate to be clearly in the moment when it became possible to rent airplanes that turned out to be useless in the post-Soviet space for cheap, and then exporting them to the expensive foreign air transportation market. Recruitment of crew for these planes was not a problem either. Many pilots who found themselves out of work were happy to return to their favorite business and earn good money that allowed them to feed their families. However, Viktor Bout's former partners believed that he was able to get the first airplanes for the promotion of his business, not due to his strong character and coincidence, but because of his connections in the GRU. He was given 3 airplanes, and in return, Bout was obliged to share part of the proceeds. The same opinion is held by supporters of the version which we call Western at the beginning of the video, adding that the interest was not only and not so much in kickbacks from the proceeds, but in the possibility to use Bout for their own transportation tasks. Simultaneously with the collapse of the Soviet Union, communist regimes were overthrown in a number of the USSR's Eastern Bloc allies. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent unification of Germany, the days of the Soviet military group there were numbered. It was impossible to remove all military equipment from Germany. It was not economically feasible. The cost of transportation was too high, but this equipment could be sold, and in such a delicate event, the help of a person who speaks several languages and has experience in organizing large-scale air transportation cannot be underestimated. That is why it is believed the planes chartered by Bout always received all the necessary flight permits, and the weapons were delivered to the clients just in time. According to supporters of the Western version, Bout paid a small symbolic sum for the lease of these airplanes, and in return, the GRU was able to continue sending weapons to different parts of the world. Viktor Bout's former partner, Sergei Menheyev, believed that at first Bout was simply following orders from big men from Moscow, and only after that he started to form his own business. But even after he got his own company, he still remained in the orbit of influence of his high-ranking patrons. But even if we accept the fact that Viktor was under the hood of influential people, it did not prevent him from developing his business. He had learned well one of the unspoken laws of air transportation: never fly empty. Bout strove to get loads wherever his planes landed. After landing in Goma with parts for attack helicopters, Bout's planes would take off with a shipment of coltan, and after delivering Kalashnikov assault rifles to Kandahar, carpets would be loaded into the same hold a couple hours later. Frozen chickens, gladioluses, TV sets, whatever. The main thing was the airplane did not fly empty. Bout's entrepreneurial talent was definitely there and allowed his firm to grow very quickly, so that by 1993 he had his own, not rented air fleet. Thus, 4 AN-8 airplanes, 2 AN-12s, an AN-24 and an Mi-8 helicopter were purchased from the Zlatust machine building plant. And in 1993, Bout opened an office in the UAE and registered a company there under the name Transavia. The UAE was ideal for Bout's growing business as it is in the junction of many trade routes in Europe, Asia and Africa. The Emirates welcomed foreign companies in the early 1990s. Local legislation encouraged their influx with economic incentives and low taxes, and Sharjah, the city whose airport Bout used as his company's main transportation hub, was struggling to get out of Dubai's shadow. Of course, its old airport with only one runway could not compete with Dubai's huge airport in terms of passenger traffic, but local officials decided to go the other way. They started luring foreign cargo companies. Passenger transportation had failed, they thought, so they would take the upper hand at the expense of cargo transportation. In addition to luring companies, Sharjah Airport also invited foreign experts, one of whom, named Richard Chichakli, was once quite friendly with Bout. Chichakli was a Syrian-born former US Army sergeant whose background includes studies in Riyadh, where he said he was even friends with a young Osama bin Laden and participation in the Gulf War. After his military service, he earned a degree in accounting and started a financial consulting business. He was so successful that he was noticed by enterprising Sharjah businessmen who decided to make the yesterday's war veteran a director of the airport's free economic zone. But back to Transavia. Bout's chartered transporters delivered to many countries household goods, mainly household appliances and electronics. And it was then that Bout first encountered weapons as well. However, those transactions were quite legal. Viktor began to provide his site in Saja for refueling and maintenance of Russian AN-124 Ruslan planes, which were delivering cargo from Russia to Africa, making intermediate landings in the UAE. Transavia tried to make money on literally everything. For example, the company transported French peacekeepers to Rwanda and for a year and a half provided all transportation for the Belgian military contingent in Somalia. Once Viktor Bout's charges even had to deliver French satellites from Toulouse to Kourou, a French spaceport located in Guyana. Viktor's income was growing, and he began to think more often about the need to expand his business. As Bout later mentioned in interviews, he wanted to create a transportation and passenger air carrier like Virgin Atlantic, and in 1995, the first step towards this goal was taken. Bout's company, Transaviation Network Group, opened a representative office in Belgium. Transport planes were to be located on leased sites of the Oosten airfield. There, as well as Saja Airport, cargo flights to all sides of the world could be made. However, not only good news was in Bout's life during that period, sometimes there was no less stress, such as, for example, the case discussed next. In August 1995, an IL-76TD airplane chartered by Bout from the Tatarstan airline Aerostan was on a flight from Saja to Bagram, Afghanistan. In the skies over Afghanistan, the plane was intercepted by a MiG-21 fighter jet of the Taliban, an organization banned in Russia, and then forced to land in Kandahar for cargo inspection. On board was a 30-ton set of ammunition for Kalashnikov assault rifles. It was a perfectly legal cargo that the pilots had flown from Albania to Kabul, ordered by the legitimate Afghan government. The Taliban militants who were fighting it felt entitled to detain both the plane and the crew. The pilots were able to escape only a year later, when, under the pretext of checking the plane's engines, they managed to disarm 3 armed guards and flew through Iran to the UAE. Viktor Bout was not a bystander in this story. As a superior who cared about his subordinates, he felt it was his duty to save them. Throughout the year of confinement in Kandahar, Bout tried to supply the pilots with food and medicine and brought doctors from the Saja clinic to the crew. And only after all negotiations had reached an impasse, he began to look for alternative options to save the crew. Thus, help came from the customers of the cargo, the legitimate Afghan government and Afghan President Rabbani. There is reason to believe that among the Taliban, there was an agent of the Afghan intelligence who threw to the Taliban the idea that an airplane that had been idle for a long time without maintenance may be unsuitable for further operation. The Taliban wanted to avoid this, but they had no specialists to inspect the aircraft, so the captive crew had to do it. The Russian pilots were allowed to inspect the plane, refuel it, and even make small test runs on the runway. At this point, the viewer may have a question: why didn't the crew fly away immediately at the first such run? But not everything was so simple. A special permit is required to fly over countries, and in the case of a flight over Iran, such a permit must be requested 5 days before takeoff. This is where all of Viktor Bout's connections came in handy, and he got this permission. After the successful escape, Viktor personally met the prisoners in Saja airport. For a long time, weapons did not occupy the first places in Viktor Bout's financial statements in terms of profitability. Chickens, household appliances, and flowers were much more successful. Yes, ordinary gladioluses. A gladiolus bought in Johannesburg for $2 was sold in Dubai for $100. It is easy to imagine the size of the profit, given that for one flight IL could deliver up to 20 tons of flowers. At the end of 1997, Bout's airline became the second largest operator of Saja Airport in terms of transportation, second only to such a giant as the German Lufthansa. However, if the Saja Finance Department had known how Bout's company had actually achieved this honorable second place, it would hardly have awarded him. Bout grew rich. Pretty soon, he could even afford to buy real estate in South Africa. The villa and the office bought in joint use with business partners cost $800,000. Of course, such a successful and charismatic businessman attracted attention of local elites. Subsequently, Bout was often accused of quietly socializing with such uncouth figures as Charles Taylor of Liberia, Mobutu Seko of Zaire, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, and other people whose photo on the covers of the Times and the New York Herald Tribune are accompanied by headlines in the spirit of cannibals and dictators. The press accused Bout of being almost buddies with Jean-Pierre Bemba, later indicted by the International Criminal Court for several crimes against humanity. A scandal was caused by rumors that Viktor Bout was allegedly among the guests of honor at the wedding of King Mswati III of Swaziland, the last absolute monarch in Africa. The media in general likes to attribute to Bout's acquaintances with criminals and dictators, but all publications that told readers about Bout's friendships with this or that public enemy had one drawback: lack of evidence. These articles had huge headlines, but they were never contained. For example, joint photos of Bout with those people, the fact of acquaintance with whom the journalist attributed to him. Viktor Bout has never denied the fact of air transportation of cargoes to Afghanistan by his company, but with one important reservation: these cargoes were never intended for the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, an organization banned in Russia. Bout, he said, had only two customers in Afghanistan: the internationally recognized Afghan government and the Northern Alliance, which opposed the Taliban. Bout's flights helped restore Russian influence in Afghanistan that had been lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first of these flights date back to late 1992. Just then, after several years of fighting between the Mujahideen and the Taliban, which threatened to turn into a full-scale civil war, the Rabbani government was formed in Afghanistan. Its defense minister, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was fond of Viktor Bout, calling him a true miracle worker, capable of replenishing depleted stocks of weapons. The link between Bout and Massoud was Abdul Latif. After the Northern Alliance troops took Kabul in April 1992, he had a lot of work to do, but Latif did his job well, handling Bout's money in Dubai and in return receiving machine guns, sniper rifles, shells and ammunition. Massoud, however, was a little annoyed by the fact that, in his opinion, sometimes Bout overestimated the cost of some supplies. For example, one tank shell cost Massoud $60, while in Russia it officially cost only about $10. But they had no other alternative to Bout. First of all, in terms of accuracy and timeliness of delivery, so they had to overpay. The Russian government did not officially sell weapons to Afghanistan at that time. Relations between the countries remained rather cool for a long time, primarily because of outbreaks of ethnic conflicts along the border between Afghanistan and the former Soviet republics to the south, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Moscow suspected the Afghan government of aiding and abetting Tajik insurgents, who had previously had to send a 25,000-strong military contingent to subdue them, and the two countries even exchanged notes of protest after an incident involving an attack on a Russian military outpost. So given this environment, Bout had to operate covertly, and apart from the episode with the previously described flight to Kabul, he was quite successful. In 1992, NATO representatives revealed Bout's involvement in the supply of weapons to Bosnia and Herzegovina, one of the 6 Balkan republics that emerged as a result of the collapse of Yugoslavia. Serbs in the Bosnian state feared their minority status and opposed its independence, believing it would be better off as an autonomy within Serbia. The Bosnian Muslims, supported by Croatia, on the contrary, favored the idea of independence. So when Bosnia and Herzegovina became a state in April 1992, there was a natural conflict. Wanting to somehow stop the bloodshed, the UN came up with nothing better than an arms embargo on all sides. The embargo gave an advantage to the Serbs, who at that time had far more options. The Bosnians had no weaponry and no army, so the US and most of Europe, while paying lip service to the arms embargo, were in fact willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that someone would arm the Bosnians. The main supplier of weapons to them was a little-known organization called the Third World Relief Agency, or TWRA for short. This organization existed for only 3 years, from 1992 to 1995, but during this time about $400 million passed through it. The first operation of the organization dates back to September 1992. Then Viktor Bout's transport plane was hired and a flight was sent from Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, to the airport of Slovenian Maribor as the closest to Bosnia, with a cargo of humanitarian aid, which included 120 tons of Kalashnikov rifles, RPGs, mines, and other deadly toys. How was this even possible, you may ask? How could an arms dealer do his job right in the middle of Europe? The answer is simple. In those years, his activities were perceived as beneficial to the civilized community, which was interested in the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Radical Islam in those days was not yet perceived as a threat to national security, and Bout's activities, despite all their ambiguity, were not yet even vaguely perceived as a threat to the political and economic interests of the United States and Europe. Austrian officials, namely Austrian investigators who established the link between Bout's companies and the supply of weapons to Bosnia, also did not oppose TWRA activities in any way. They honestly recorded the fact of the organization's activities in the arms trade, but since none of the deliveries even came close to the Austrian border, they could not do anything about it. From the point of view of the law, Bout remained crystal clear. In 1997, Congo was going through a bad time. Rebels led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, a former student of Che Guevara himself, backed by the armies of Uganda and Rwanda, launched an offensive against the incumbent regime of Mobutu Sese Seko. While Kabila was struggling to wrest control of the country from Mobutu, the Rwandans and Ugandans were busy searching the Congo for Hutus. The participants in the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994 had managed to find refuge in Congo, but now retribution was close at hand. The UN tried to help the population to the best of its ability in such a situation, and its officials made frequent visits to Congo. In March 1997, one such official witnessed a very strange incident at Kisangani Airport. He saw an IL-76 landing. After beginning to unload the humanitarian cargo, the plane was delivering food, crew members pulled out a ladder, put it against the tail of the plane, and removed the UN emblem. When the unloading was over, boxes of weapons, recognizable boxes of Kalashnikov assault rifles, and ammunition began to be placed in the plane's cargo hold. After all loading was complete, the plane departed. No more than 50 minutes elapsed from landing to takeoff. The official witnessed Viktor Bout's favorite move and a living embodiment of his main principle: the plane should never fly empty. IL-76 delivered food to Kisangani under the official auspices of the UN and flew away with a cargo of weapons intended for unknown units, most likely for the Rwandan army. With one shot, Bout killed not even 2 but 3 birds with one stone. He provided his planes with profitable cargo, fulfilled a deal with his partner, and importantly ingratiated himself with the global organization, which is the UN, by delivering its cargo to those in need. Bout was capitalizing on several sides of the Congolese conflict at once. His planes were able to deliver humanitarian aid to refugees and arms to Kabila's rebels, all while maintaining good relations with Seko Mobutu, from whose decrepit hands power was slipping at this time. The Pentagon military advisors and independent investigators were not even stunned by the fact that Bout was supplying arms. They were used to that. They were more outraged by the fact that Bout managed to supply weapons to several participants in the conflict at once. Thus, the Belgian John Pelleman, a former scholar of medieval literature and then one of the world's leading researchers of Victor's life and a pillar on which stands the version of Bout as a lord of war, wrote that there is no room for politics or ideology in this story. Viktor Bout, according to Pelleman, single-handedly challenged the face of an entire continent. If previously African tribes preferred to settle relations with each other with the help of spears, machetes, and ancient hunting rifles, then with the advent of affordable modernized weapons, when the African market avalanche of automatic rifles and rocket-propelled grenade launchers, the situation has changed dramatically. Pelleman likes to cite the example of the Karimojong tribe. This tribe has used weapons to settle territorial disputes for centuries, but since these weapons were pre-flood, fatalities were extremely rare, and all feuds were usually settled by clan elders. However, with the appearance of Kalashnikovs in their hands, the number of this tribe decreased several times. Bout did not forget about such pariahs of international politics as Libya and Sudan. Muammar Gaddafi sponsored many rebel armies. for which Bout acted as a supplier of weapons. The cooperation was so beneficial that Bout even opened a company operating directly from Tripoli, registered however in the Bahamas. As for Sudan, having first used Khartoum as a base for arms delivery to Bosnia, Bout continued to use it thereafter. Of course, he could not have done so without the knowledge of the local authorities, and given that the flights from Khartoum were frequent, it is hard to escape the idea that they were not lobbied at the highest local level. After earning enough money, Bout decided that he and his family would be better off living in South Africa. Sharjah was still his main transportation hub, but in conversations with friends, Bout talked about Africa being the place he wanted to live, and South Africa offered excellent opportunities for legal business, and Bout understood the importance of this point very well, and after all, Johannesburg was the most comfortable city to live in of all the African capitals. At first, everything went as well as possible. Bout moved with his family to Johannesburg. His wife Ala opened her own clothing business, and not far from the border with Zimbabwe in Petersburg, Bout found a suitable airport. His then partner, Deirdre Ward, obtained the necessary business permits and already owned a company himself, Norse Air, which had all the necessary valid certificates to fly. On February 19, 1997, Bout's Liberian company, AirSES and Norse Air incorporated a new company, Petersburg Aviation Services and Systems Pty, or AirPass. Bout owned 90% of the new company and Ward owned the remaining 10%. In exchange for that 10%, Ward allowed Bout to use Norse Air's charter operator's license, which allowed the new company to operate in South Africa. According to the now familiar Richard Chichakli, Bout paid about $2 million for his share. Bout also used his own money to build a refrigeration plant, thanks to which he began to transport frozen chickens, a very profitable commodity in countries with hot climates and no conditions for storing meat. Bout liked doing business from Petersburg so much that he even discussed with Chichakli the possibility of opening a South African version of a free trade zone like Sharjah. Viktor was also going to invest in the garment business here and open a factory, but these endeavors remained only in the plans. In November 1997, Bout went with his family to his own mansion in the Sandhurst district of Johannesburg, where the unfortunate incident that ended Bout's business in South Africa took place. Viktor's house was burglarized, and it happened late in the evening when the entire family was at home. With the help of accomplices of the bandits from among the domestic workers, the alarm system in the house had been disabled, so the attack by the Gang of 10 came as a complete surprise to the owners. The guards and Viktor were not around. Bout's mother-in-law and wife were beaten. Some sources say that during the raid from Bout's house disappeared only phones and computers with valuable information, while others, on the contrary, say that the catch of the raiders were almost $6 million, which Viktor kept in his personal safe. What is clear is that this was not a random robbery of a wealthy house by a street gang, but the reasons will probably remain a mystery. The local police, on the other hand, couldn't even find the burglars. Bout then put the house up for sale and moved his family back to Sharjah. Meanwhile, the clouds were gathering over AirPass. Thus, the country's authorities came to the conclusion that in the activities of the previously impeccable firm, there were over 146 violations of the national legislation on civil aviation, and the South African Department of Home Affairs also declared Bout an undesirable alien and refused to issue him a new visa. It is not known who exactly forced Bout out of South Africa. There is an opinion that it could be the intrigues of Russian criminal groups, which were also engaged in the organization of cargo transportation, and they did not need such a successful competitor. There is also a version that the night raid on Bout's house is the work of Western Special Services, which already then, in 1997, realized what destructive consequences for the African continent could lead to Bout's activities and were ready to achieve his departure from the country at any cost. And other researchers consider the raid as revenge on the part of the American intelligence, which allegedly, shortly before that, inclined Bout to cooperate, hoping to learn from him information about his customers and buyers. Bout refused the offer, after which his days in South Africa were numbered. In May 1998, the aviation authorities of neighboring Swaziland, over which Bout's planes flew, under pressure from the South African authorities, suspended the flights of 43 planes of 5 of Viktor's companies accusing him of lack of proper documentation as well as illegal arms shipments from Mozambique to Angola. Among the cargo found on one of the planes were 2 disassembled Russian military helicopters packed in crates labeled machine parts. Investigators suspected they were destined for Rwanda. However, despite this, Bout's planes were soon spotted in the sky again, but already over another part of Africa. In the winter of 1996 and spring of 1997, a young Afghan man named Farid Ahmed could often be seen at Sharjah airport who seemed intent on settling in the local air cargo hangars and offices. He had been secretly sent to Sharjah by the Taliban, who had become the new government of Afghanistan. Just a month and a half before, they had stormed into Kabul and defeated the weakened government of Bout's former buyer, Burhanuddin Rabbani. But the king is dead. Long live the new king. The new government was as much in need of Viktor Bout's arms as the old one. The Taliban were fighting against Rabbani's government and forces loyal to his defense minister, Ahmad Shah Massoud, and were primarily dependent on Pakistan's intelligence services and armed forces for their tasks, artillery, and ammunition. But the relations with the Pakistanis began to sour after the Taliban captured Jalalabad and entered Kabul in late September 1996. In their eagerness to disperse the remnant of Massoud's forces, the Taliban's top leadership began to irritate Pakistani officials. Not independent enough to break away from their Pakistani patrons, the Taliban mullahs began to show a vested interest in developing an independent procurement capability, as analysts at Human Rights Watch later concluded. US military intelligence later agreed with this assessment. Pakistan played a big role in supplying weapons, certainly, but they supplied mostly large weapons, tanks, trucks, heavy artillery. But small arms, which are the lifeblood of any army, the Taliban had to get on their own, and they were looking for them absolutely everywhere. In late 1996, the Taliban regime began operating through Farid Ahmed. As a representative of Atta Mansour, the Taliban defense minister, Ahmed was given full control over the personnel and bank accounts of Arania, the only Afghan airline that had the right to fly internationally. Ahmed was entrusted with the difficult task of sourcing weapons for the army and cargo planes for the Taliban Air Force. The UAE was one of only 3 countries in the world, along with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, to recognize the new Taliban regime. UAE leader and founder Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan spoke of the new Taliban leadership in exceptionally enthusiastic terms. Eager to help his new friends, Sheikh Maktoum even agreed to waive all landing fees for Ariana planes, a move that was to further boost traffic in Sharjah. In addition, the airport in Sharjah seemed to have been purpose-built for all sorts of dark deeds. Inspection at the airport was formal and rules were easily circumvented. Planes landed and took off regularly. Ground handlers quickly unloaded cargo from airplanes without interference from airport security personnel. It was for this reason that the Taliban sent their envoy to Sharjah, where he met Viktor Bout. A few weeks after arriving in Sharjah, Ahmed, along with Ariana's director, met 2 Russian businessmen there. One was a fat man with half-lidded eyes and a neatly trimmed moustache who took the lead in conversations. The Russian did not give his name to the Afghan leader, but years later, the Ariana director identified the heavy-set man as Bout, recognizing his unruffled face from a color portrait published in the New York Times in 2003. When the meeting ended and the Russians left, Ahmed told the director that he had made a deal with Bout's company, AirSes, to get part for the planes. The director also recalled that an unofficial bonus to the deal was the sale of arms and ammunition to the Taliban, the delivery of which for Ariana was to be handled by another Sharjah-based firm, Flying Dolphin, owned by the Emirates Sheikh. In fact, Bout was only responsible for delivering the cargoes needed by the Taliban to Sharjah, after which the cargoes would continue on Ariana's plane to Kabul and Kandahar airports. Bout himself categorically denied that he had dealt with Taliban officials and repeatedly stated that he had never done business with Al-Qaeda or any other Islamic militants. "I have not made any contracts with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda," he insisted in a 2002 Moscow radio interview. In a public statement issued later that year, Bout said, "I am not and have never been associated with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or any of their officials or affiliated organizations. Neither I nor any of my organizations." In his hard-hitting assessment of world politics, Bout scoffed in his Moscow interview that US officials conveniently ignored his own historic role in arming Afghan fighters, using him as a scapegoat to claim it was the Russians' fault. Bout's arrangements with the Taliban were secretly carried out for nearly 5 years before their extent was revealed by press reports and intelligence reports that emerged only after the all-too-familiar fallout in New York City in the early 21st century. Both Bout and the mullahs proved to be masters of operating in the shadows. Between 1998 and 2001, Bout's network and other Sharjah-based air transport companies secretly sold 12 heavy-lift cargo planes to the Taliban, allowing the militant air force to bolster its air fleet and deliver tons of Eastern European weapons to Afghanistan, not counting the movement of weapons and thousands of fighters inside the country. US officials later concluded that some of the arms shipments had been given to Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda operatives. Of course, this state of affairs could not be tolerated. On October 15, 1999, the Security Council voted unanimously to freeze Taliban assets, impose a complete arms embargo, and ban all international flights operated by Taliban airlines. Virtually all of Ariana's international flights, except for a few humanitarian flights, were shut down. Thus, Viktor Bout was deprived of the most important element of the well-functioning mechanism that ensured the supply of weapons to Afghanistan. Without Ariana, his activities in the area were meaningless. In November 1999, Viktor Bout embarked on a plan to increase his fortune. The location was to be Africa, and the object of enrichment was to be coltan, a rare mineral mined in southwestern Sierra Leone that is used in the manufacture of electronics. Coltan mining is nowhere near the size it used to be, but in the late 1990s, there was a consistently large demand for it. According to Douglas Farrar, Viktor Bout offered to supply weapons to the RUF, that is, the Revolutionary United Front, free of charge, and in return, he asked only for one thing: the seizure of several abandoned mines in the southwest of the country. Viktor told the RUF leaders that he had connections with interested investors from Russia, that they would not begin their investments until they had a firm assurance of safety. The meeting between Viktor Bout and RUF chief Ibrahim Baha was arranged by Charles Taylor, a regular client of Bout's and one of West Africa's most powerful warlords, an architect of the Liberian Civil War, and a participant in the military coup in Burkina Faso. He had promised Bout for years as a reward for his years of help to discuss taking over the mines. At the meeting, he was told that with all the necessary equipment and weapons, the takeover would take a month at most. However, these plans were not to be realized. A short time after the meeting, at which Bout received the consent of Ibrahim Baha, the latter was removed from the command of the troops because of serious disagreements with Foday Sanko, who was at that time the supreme commander of the RUF. Thus, all of Bout's hopes of gaining control of the mines collapsed. However, Bout was not upset for long. Charles Taylor soon needed a lot of weapons again. A group of rebels from neighboring Guinea, led by some of Taylor's former field commanders, began a military campaign to overthrow the latter. Bout's help came in handy. By 2006, Bout's planes stopped taking off from Sharjah International Airport, but this was not a problem. Airports in Kishinev, Almaty, Fujairah, and other cities replaced them. By this point, Bout had been a permanent resident of Russia for several years. A year earlier, he had to leave the UAE because the pressure on Bout's business, which was exerted on the local government by American officials, made it simply impossible for him to do business here. And in 2002, Belgium became the first country to accuse him of illegal activities, namely diamond smuggling and money laundering of over $300 million. In the same year, the UN imposed a ban on Bout's movements, and in 2005, even demanded to freeze all his accounts. Viktor, by the way, then claimed that as a result of these sanctions, he lost more than $17 million. Even earlier, around the time when Bout, in the company of Ibrahim Baha, was contemplating the possibility of seizing the mines in Sierra Leone, the US government began investigating Bout's activities. The hunt for Viktor began in earnest. Johann Pellermann, who by that time had already completely abandoned his studies in medieval literature, became a UN counselor and collected a whole file on Bout's case. That's why Bout lived in Moscow, where he was often seen in the offices of companies that traded abroad. Sometimes Viktor also appeared in the media field giving interviews. One of them, dating back to 2005, refers to cinematography. That year, the movie Lord of War, directed by Andrew Niccol, was released. The creator of this movie, long before its premiere, stated in public that the biography of the main character, Yuri Orlov, is based on the biography of Viktor Bout. This movie, which incidentally a few years later still has a role to play in the life of Bout, did not make the slightest impression on Viktor. "I didn't like the movie. I felt sorry for Nicolas Cage," Bout told a journalist. Viktor Bout's brother, Sergei, often compared the activity of an airline broker to the profession of a cab driver. A cab driver would never ask a passenger what is in his suitcase. A cab driver should only take the passenger from point A to point B, and other details do not concern him. Even if the cab driver has some guesses about what the passenger has in his bag, he should keep those guesses to himself. Actually, the version we named at the beginning of the Russian version is in fact that Viktor Bout was such a cab driver throughout his life, achieved everything by his own labor, accustomed to always rely only on himself, executive and responsible businessman. This is how our hero appears to the apologist of this approach to the interpretation of his life path. Yesterday's young officer, who sincerely wanted to connect his fate with the army but left it after 1991, had no doubts about the correctness of his choice. In the conditions of the country's collapse, changing priorities and political instability, he did only what he considered his duty, to take care of his family and his friends. Viktor Bout decided to use his knowledge and experience to organize cargo transportation. Having no connections except acquaintances with his former co-workers with extremely meager starting baggage, Viktor achieved impressive results. In a country where it had long been considered indecent to ask rich people questions about the origin of their capital, Viktor had nothing to hide. He lost his place at MGIMO for lack of one certificate, worked hard for a long time in Mozambique, where he even had a fever and never had high patrons. Viktor Bout always observed business ethics in relation to his clients. He did not seek to know more about the cargo being delivered than what was stated in the documents accompanying it, and his clients knew it. Viktor was always mindful of how much effort he had put into his business, so the idea that he could jeopardize it is preposterous. If Bout's guilt in the crimes is obvious, why for so many years the authorities of many countries could not prove anything? Why was Viktor pressured with some far-fetched pretexts? The already mentioned story about Bout's stay in South Africa, for example, looks strange from the point of view of the rule of law. At first, the South African authorities initiated an investigation into Bout's companies operating in the country, but after multiple violations of the local aviation legislation were found in a record short period of time, Bout was not charged with anything. The Belgian authorities followed a roughly similar scenario, and 7 years after Bout ceased all trading operations in the country, accused him of money laundering and issued an international warrant for his arrest by Interpol. In fact, Bout's successful air transportation business was shut down not for economic reasons, not because it was unprofitable, but only because of his damaged image. An accusation of this nature haunted Bout right up to his arrest, which in a sense can be considered the apotheosis of his life's journey. Congratulations, you have convicted Nicolas Cage. Rumor has it that these were the words spoken by Viktor Bout's wife after the announcement of the verdict. Despite the many rumors linking Bout to a number of diverse crimes and violations of the law, the only crime for which he was ultimately punished was a sham. Bout's attorney, Steve Vizzo, said, "Don't forget, his crime is a talking crime. No guns were sold, no one paid money for it. It was a trumped-up crime created solely to charge him. And then for this colloquial crime, the prosecution demanded life in prison without parole." Viktor Bout was arrested in March 2008 in Thailand. His arrest was the crowning achievement of an operation designed by Juan Zarate, an advisor in the George W. Bush administration and agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. Agents posing as representatives of the Colombian FARC rebels reached Bout through one of his former partners, British citizen Andrew Smuggling. The rebels were allegedly interested in the possibility of buying Igla manpads, thanks to which they could shoot down American helicopters. The same agents devised a plan to lure Bout out of Russia and bring charges against him that would allow him to be tried in US jurisdiction. Why did Bout, who had not left Russia for several years, decide to travel so far? There are different opinions on this matter. As an example, Viktor was simply tired of being in constant isolation. In addition, he did not want to miss the opportunity to make a major deal. It was too serious a sum to entrust its discussion to any partner. If the preliminary stages of the deal Bout conducted in absentia, through a companion or by telephone, the figures here required his personal presence. At the meeting, the DEA agents made a real spectacle of it, deliberately provoking Viktor to hang himself with the heaviest articles of the American Criminal Code. There is an audio recording of this conversation made by the agents as evidence, but it was never made public, and the public had to be satisfied only with excerpts from the transcripts made. Thus, according to the judge, to the words of the buyers that the weapons were intended to kill American soldiers, Bout replied, "We have a common enemy." After these words, Viktor was detained by Thai police, accompanied by other DEA agents on a warrant that was issued by a local court in January 2008 at the request of the United States. As for Bout's partner, Smuggling, he too was detained but then released. Less than a day later, he flew to New York, where he voluntarily appeared in court, which took him into custody. There were well-founded suspicions that he had been cooperating with the Americans from the very beginning, and it was his idea to lure Bout to Thailand. In May 2012, Smuggling was sentenced to 5 years in prison, 4 of which, however, he had already served. On November 16, 2010, Viktor Bout was extradited to the United States, where he was charged with 4 counts: criminal conspiracy to murder US citizens, criminal conspiracy to murder persons in government service, criminal conspiracy to purchase and sell man-portable air defense systems or MANPADS, criminal conspiracy to assist in foreign organization recognized as a terrorist organization. At the trial, Bout argued that when he agreed to supply weapons, in reality, he was only going to sell 2 cargo planes that were gathering dust in the Congo. But these arguments did not convince the judge and jury, which on November 2nd unanimously convicted Bout on all 4 counts. Bout's defense, however, asked to overturn the verdict, as during the hearing an interesting detail emerged. The jury forewoman Heather Hobson, in an interview with the New York Times, admitted that she had seen the already mentioned film Lord of War, which somewhat influenced her decision. However, then it turned out that this movie Heather saw not during the trial, but several years before it. The verdict was upheld, and Bout had only to scold Cage for his convincing acting. On April 5th, 2012, a New York City court sentenced Bout to 25 years in prison, which he served in the infamous ADX Florence maximum security prison. In prison, Viktor tried not to lose heart. He read a lot, drew, practiced yoga. In his letters to his family, Bout never complained about the inconveniences and lamented only that by the time he left prison, he would be an old man, that he would not be able to see his daughter grow up with his own eyes. However, fortunately for Bout, fate had other plans for him. On February 17, 2022, an ordinary flight from New York landed at Moscow's Sheremetyevo Airport. Among its passengers was a 31-year-old US citizen basketball player Brittney Griner. From Moscow, Brittney was going to Yekaterinburg, where her teammates were waiting for her, UMMC, with whom she was supposed to prepare for the new sports season. But at the airport, her luggage was found to contain e-cigarettes with liquids with traces of hashish oil, a substance that is banned for import into Russia. Griner was detained and sentenced to 9 years in a general regime colony and a fine of 1 million rubles. Members of the US government, as well as the President Joe Biden, immediately declared that such a harsh sentence was unacceptable and unjustified. They said that Griner's detention was a purely political gesture, as the trumped-up charges turned the Olympic champion into a diplomatic hostage. But there was a violation of Russian law, and in addition to loud words, the State Department needed to take other, more concrete steps for the release of its citizen. At first, the US government offered to exchange Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan, a US citizen detained in Russia in 2018 for espionage and sentenced to a 16-year term, for Viktor Bout. On July 27, 2022, it was announced that Joe Biden had approved it, but diplomats from both countries eventually agreed that it would be better to conduct this procedure on a one-to-one format, with only Bout and Griner involved. On December 8, 2022, The long-awaited exchange took place at Abu Dhabi Airport. Viktor Bout spent a total of 14 years and 9 months behind bars. The domestic press noted with deep satisfaction the fact of his return to his homeland. 3 days later, Bout was accepted into the ranks of the LDPR party and is currently lecturing about his time in an American prison. Viktor Bout is only 56 years old and he is free, so who knows, maybe we will hear more about him. This was the story of Viktor Bout, a story where it is still to this day impossible to fully determine who this man really was. Maybe an international arms dealer making millions of dollars. Maybe he was a cab driver who drove the necessary goods at the behest of the powers that be, without asking unnecessary questions. Or maybe an ordinary businessman who was lied to and illegally imprisoned. Today, we only gave you different views on his fate, and what to believe and what not to believe is up to you.